What if submission is not a single decision, but a lifelong unfolding? What if saying I believe does not mean belief has truly settled within you? What if Islam and Īmān are not the same thing? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if submission has stages, where are you actually standing today? Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Reflection, where we explore the wisdom of the Quran through the lens of Tafsir al-Mīzān by Allama Muhammad Hussain Tabatabai. Many people assume that submission is a single moment. You pronounce the Shahadatain, you enter Islam, and the story feels complete. But the Quran does not speak that way. It presents submission as something that deepens from the tongue to the heart and then into the inner self. And this is where the real tension begins, because the Quran does not merely ask whether you submit. It asks something far more demanding. Has submission reached the point where nothing inside you resists what Allah has decreed? Is your Islam only outward, or has it begun to take the form of inward surrender? The Quran confronts this distinction directly after addressing people who outwardly submit. Allah says in Surah Al-Hujurat, Surah 49, verse 14, قَالَتِ الْأَعْرَابُ آمَنَّا قُلْ لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا ولما يدخل الإيمان في قلوبكم. The desert Arabs say, we believe. Say, you have not yet believed. Rather say, we have submitted. For belief has not yet entered your hearts. Pause with that for a moment, because this verse is not dismissing them. It is locating them. It is showing us that Islam and Īmān are not identical. Submission can exist without faith, and faith, when it appears, does not arrive all at once. As Allama Tabatabai shows in al-Mizan, this is not a moral judgment. It is a map of growth, a map that traces how submission and faith unfold, stage by stage, each with its own challenges, its own risks, and its own form of resistance. In this episode, we will walk through 4 stages. First, how the Quran distinguishes between Islam and Īmān, and why outward submission does not automatically mean inner faith. Second, the early stage of submission, where Islam is affirmed verbally and practically, but belief has not yet settled in the heart. Third, how submission and faith deepen together, moving from compliance to conviction, and from conviction towards certainty. And finally, the highest stage of submission, where the believer offers no inner resistance to the will and decree of Allah. This is not about labeling people. It is about locating ourselves honestly. So pause for a moment, not as judgment, but as honesty. What still resists within you? Before the Quran speaks about deep faith, it establishes something more basic: outward submission. This is the doorway into Islam. It begins with the Shahadatain, the testimony that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. By these words, a person enters the Muslim community. They are recognized outwardly as Muslim. They participate in its rituals. They fall within its legal and social framework. But notice something very important here. The Quran does not equate the stage with faith, because at this level, submission can exist without deep inner conviction. Allah draws this distinction with striking precision in Surah Al-Hujurat, Surah 49, verse 14. The desert Arabs say, we believe. Say, you have not yet believed. Rather say, we have submitted, for belief has not yet entered your hearts. Look carefully at what the verse is doing. It's not condemning them, it's describing their condition. Their submission is real, but it remains external. They have entered Islam, yet Īmān has not fully taken root. Allama Tabatabai draws attention in al-Mizan to the precision of this distinction. This stage establishes belonging, not completion. At this level, actions may precede conviction. Obedience may still feel mechanical. Belief may exist but remains fragile, unsettled, or unformed. And this is why the Quran speaks here about entry, not depth, about affiliation, not transformation. The Imams illuminate this relationship with remarkable, powerful analogy. Imam Jafar as-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi said, "Mathalul imani مع الإسلام كمثل الكعبة مع الحرم قد يكون الإنسان في الحرم ولا يكون في الكعبة ولا يكون في الكعبة إلا وهو في الحرم. The relationship of faith to Islam is like the relationship of the Kaaba to the sanctuary. One may be in the sanctuary without being in the Kaaba, but one cannot be in the Kaaba without being in the sanctuary. Pause and sit with the image. Islam is the enclosure. Īmān is the center. One can stand within Islam without yet arriving at faith, but one cannot arrive at faith without first passing through submission. So this stage is not false. It is foundational, it is necessary, but it is not the end of the journey. And this raises a quiet but unsettling question. If Islam is only the doorway, what happens when someone never walks further? Once the Quran distinguishes between outward submission and inner belief, it points to the next movement on the path, faith entering the heart. This is the first stage of Īmān. Belief is no longer sustained by habit, environment, or conformity alone. Something internal awakens. The heart begins to recognize what the tongue had already declared. Obedience is no longer performed merely because it is required. It begins to feel true. The Quran describes this transition with remarkable precision in Surah Al-Hujurat, Surah 49, verse 15. إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِاللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ ثُمَّ لَمْ يَرْتَابُوا وَجَاهَدُوا بِأَمْوَالِهِمْ وَأَنفُسِهِمْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الصَّادِقُونَ. The believers are only those who believe in Allah and His Messenger. Then do not doubt and strive with their wealth and their lives in the way of Allah. They are the truthful ones. Notice how the Quran frames faith, not as a feeling, not as a claim, but as recognition that begins to stabilize the heart and reshape action. At this stage, belief is inwardly affirmed. Doubt may still appear, but it no longer governs. Obedience is no longer empty form. It becomes a sincerity in motion. Failure may still occur, but failure no longer severs belief. It provokes return. Allama Tabatabai observes in al-Mizan that this is the point where moral accountability truly begins to deepen, because actions now reflect an inner orientation, not mere compliance. The believer may still struggle, still hesitate, still fall short, but something fundamental has shifted. The heart no longer disputes the truth of God's command. And this is why the Imams speak so carefully about Īmān. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam said, لَيْسَ الْإِيمَانُ بالتمني ولا بالتحلي ولكن ما وقر في القلب وصدقه العمل. Faith is not wishful thinking or outward display. It is what settles in the heart and is confirmed by action. Reflect on that carefully. Faith has entered, but it has not yet fully stabilized. The believer now knows what is right, wants what is right, even when they do not always succeed. And that very pull, that inward recognition, is itself a sign of Īmān. So pause here and be honest. When you fall short, does something inside you still pull you back? As faith begins to settle in the heart, the Quran calls the believer to do something more demanding, not merely belief, not occasional obedience, but wholeness. This is the second stage of Islam. At this level, submission is no longer selective, no longer divided between what feels comfortable and what quietly remains resisted. The believer is no longer saying, I obey here, but hesitate there. The Quran issues this call with unmistakable clarity in Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah number 2, verse number 208. يا أيها الذين آمنوا ادخلوا في السلم كافة ولا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين. O you who believe, enter into submission completely and do not follow the footsteps of Satan. Indeed, he is to you a clear enemy. The verse addresses believers, which means partial submission is possible even after faith begins. Allama Tabatabai draws attention in al-Mizan to the precision of this command. This is not about entering Islam again. It is about removing internal partitions. At the second stage of Islam, those partitions begin to collapse. Submission is no longer external compliance. It becomes integration. Belief, action, intention, and daily life begin to draw from the same center. It appears as something far more subtle: delay, justification, selective obedience. And this is why the verse immediately warns, against the footsteps of Satan. The Imams warned repeatedly about this stage. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said, "Man ata Allahu fi ba'dhin wa asahu fi ba'd, faqad ittakhadha lahu sharikan fi ta'atihi." Whoever obeys Allah in some matters and disobeys him in others has taken a partner alongside him in obedience. Sit with the force of that statement. Because when submission becomes fragmented, the self quietly reserves sovereignty for itself. The second stage of Islam removes that reservation, not through force, but through clarity. So pause and reflect carefully. Where in your life does obedience still feel negotiable? When submission begins to take a whole and integrated form, faith itself begins to challenge. It stabilizes. This is the second stage of Īmān. At this level, belief is no longer constantly unsettled by doubt, fluctuation, or inner hesitation. Faith is no longer something a person merely holds. It becomes something they stand upon. Allama Tabatabai observed in al-Mīzān that this is the point where Īmān becomes anchored. Doubts may still arise at the level of thought, but they no longer destabilize the heart. Belief is no longer reactive. It becomes grounded. At this stage, obedience becomes more consistent. Sacrifice becomes possible. Loss no longer shatters faith. Outcomes no longer dictate trust, because certainty is not proven in comfort, it is revealed in cost. And this is why the Quran repeatedly links mature faith to striving, endurance, and sacrifice. Not because hardship creates faith, but because hardship reveals its depth. The Imams articulate this stage with remarkable clarity. Imam Ali said, لَوْ كُشِفَ الْغِطَاءُ مَزْدَدْتُ يَقِينًا. If the veil were lifted, my certainty would not increase. Pause and reflect on the magnitude of that statement. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is the description of a heart whose conviction has reached stability. A heart whose trust in God is no longer conditional on circumstance, outcome, or explanation. But even here, a subtle danger remains. Allama Tabatabai warns that certainty of belief does not automatically mean the complete surrender of the self. Because a person may reach profound conviction, yet still experience an inner tension when divine decree collides with personal desire, which is why the path does not end with certainty. Because certainty of belief is not the same as total surrender. That comes next. So pause here and ask yourself honestly, if your faith were tested through loss, through pressure, through sacrifice, would it remain subtle or would it begin to argue with God? Up to this point, the journey of submission has already been demanding. Outward obedience has taken shape. Faith has entered the heart. Certainty has begun to stabilize belief, and yet something may still remain untouched. Inner resistance, a subtle tension within the self. Because even when actions align, even when belief feels firm, the heart may still tighten when divine decree conflicts with personal desire. This is where the third stage of Islam begins. Not the submission of action, but the submission of the inner self. The Quran defines this stage with striking precision in Surah An-Nisa, Surah number 4, verse 65. فَلَا وَرَبُّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُكَ فيما شجر بينهم ثم لا يجدوا في أنفسهم حرجا مما قضيت ويسلموا تسليما. But no, by your Lord, they do not truly believe until they make you judge in what they dispute. Then find within themselves no resistance to what you have decided and submit with complete submission. Notice the extraordinary subtlety of this verse. The Quran does not stop at obedience. It goes deeper. لا يجدوا في أنفسهم حرجا. No inward tightness, no quiet protest, no hidden resentment toward what has been decreed. And then the verse concludes, وَيُسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. Total unqualified surrender. Allama Tabatabai observes in al-Mizan that this verse describes the completion of submission. Not submission of behavior, not submission of ritual, but submission of the self. At this stage, the ego no longer negotiates with God. The heart no longer contests divine decree. The self no longer competes for sovereignty. The Imams speak about this level with extraordinary seriousness. Imam Jafar Sadiq said, لَيْسَ الْإِسْلَامُ الصَّلَاةُ وَالصِّيَامُ الصيام والزكاة والحج إنما الإسلام أن تسلم الله فيما قضى وقدر وأن ترضى بحكم الله وحكم رسوله ولا تجد في نفسك حرجا مما قضى. Islam is not merely prayer, fasting, zakat and hajj. Rather, Islam is to submit to Allah in what He has decreed and determined, to be content with the judgment of Allah and His Messenger, and to find no inner resistance to what He has decided. Sit with the force of that clarification. True Islam is measured not only by what the body performs, by what the hearts no longer resist. And this is why at higher stage of submission, resistance itself becomes more subtle. It is no longer denial, no longer open rebellion. It becomes inward objection, resentment to a decree, a refusal to surrender the final word. So pause here and be honest. When God's decree collides with what you desire, do you submit or do you submit and resent? When submission reaches the point of inner surrender, faith itself undergoes another transformation. This is the third stage of Īmān. At this level, belief no longer struggles for stability. It no longer competes with doubt, hesitation, or inner fragmentation. Faith begins to permeate. It is no longer something the believer merely carries. It becomes the ground from which the believer lives. Obedience is no longer sustained through tension alone. Virtue is no longer maintained through constant inner conflict. Everything begins to flow from a heart that is awake before Allah. The Imams describe this stage not as imagination, but as presence. A life lived with awareness of God shaping intention, action, restraint, and even desire itself. Imam Jafar as-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi describes this inner equilibrium with striking clarity. لا يكون العبد مؤمنا حتى يكون خائفا راجيا ولا يكون خائفا راجيا حتى يكون عاملا لما يخاف ويرجو. A servant is not truly a believer until he lives between fear and hope. And he does not truly live between fear and hope until his actions reflect what he fears and what he hopes for. Fear without hope paralyzes, and hope without fear deceives. But at this stage, faith integrates both. Awareness governs action, recognition governs desire. Allama Tabatabai observes in al-Mizan that this represents a profound interior shift. Faith no longer sits beside desire. Faith begins to reorder desire itself. The believer no longer asks first, "What do I want?" and then negotiates with God. The orientation quietly reverses. What does Allah want? And the heart follows. Imam Ali alayhi salam describes the culmination of these states in words that carry extraordinary depth. ما عبدتك خوفا من نارك ولا طمعا في جنتك ولكن وجدتك أهلا للعبادة فعبدتك. I did not worship you out of fear of your fire, nor out of desire for your paradise, but because I found you worthy of worship, and so I worshipped you. This is not the abandonment of fear or hope, it is their completion. Fear, hope, love, and recognition now move together, without inner conflict, without negotiation, without resistance. So pause here and be honest. If faith no longer needed to be defended, justified, or enforced, who would you become? We have moved carefully through the Quranic landscape of submission and faith, not as labels, not as identities, but as stages of becoming. Because what the Quran reveals is not a single moment called Islam, and not a single state called Īmān, but a path that deepens, refines, and quietly reshapes the human being from the outside inward. So before we close, pause for a moment. Let us sit with what this journey has been quietly revealing, not as theory, but as something that speaks directly to how we live. Submission may begin outwardly, but it does not end outwardly. A person may enter Islam through words and action, while faith has not yet fully settled within the heart. The Quran draws this distinction not to condemn, but to invite growth. Second, faith deepens as submission becomes internal. When obedience is no longer mechanical, when belief begins to shape intention, when the heart recognizes what the tongue had declared, Īmān begins to take root, even as struggle remains. Third, the most demanding stage of Islam is not outward obedience. It is the removal of inner resistance. True submission is revealed not only in what we do, but in what happens inside us when divine decree conflicts with personal desire. Fourth, at the highest stage of Īmān, faith no longer struggles for stability. Virtue is no longer forced. Sincerity is no longer strained. The believer lives from a heart aligned with Allah, where awareness quietly governs intention, action, and desire itself. And this is the question the Quran ultimately leaves us with. What level of submission has truly taken root within you, and what still resists? If this reflection resonated with you, consider supporting the channel. Subscribe for future episodes, leave your thoughts in the comment, and if you found value in this discussion, a simple thumbs up helps this message reach others. Until next week, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.